Welcome to our next in our series on Philippians. We're finishing up chapter 1 today, looking at the last few verses, kind of where we left off last week in the middle of a verse and then bring it to a conclusion. Paul is making some very important points here, kind of bringing to a close this particular section. So let me read these last few verses of the chapter, and then we'll have a discussion about this. He says in chapter 1, verse 27, where we were leaving last week, "Only conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or remain absent, I may hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel. In no way alarmed by your opponents, which is a sign of destruction for them, but of salvation for you, and that too from God. For to you it has been granted for Christ's sake not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for his sake, experiencing the same conflict which you saw in me, and now here to be in me." So what he's getting at here is that there is going to be suffering, of course, there is going to be the potential for conflict and striving, but the type of striving or conflict that Paul is referring to here is a little bit different than what we might think of as in contention or people at odds with each other. Here, he's going to make or place emphasis on that word in a little bit different way. But toward the end of verse 27, where we were working last week, he says, with one mind striving together, with one mind, a common idea or group moving forward. Actually, the word mind there can be translated as soul. It's where the word breath comes from. So we're all breathing and working together in the same at the same pace. It makes me think of a pair or a group of people who are running. Quite often near our house, there's a running group that comes by in the evening. And they're all different sizes and shapes, and men and women. But as they go by, their pace is steady together. They are running as a group. Now, some of them obviously are running a little bit more slowly maybe than they would. Others a little more quickly than they normally would. But they're running at a pace, and they're working together, striving toward that goal of finishing however many miles they have ahead of them. And that's kind of what we're looking at as believers. I have a very different background in history and interests and likes and problems and tendencies and all those sorts of things than the person next to me. But we strive together for one purpose, working in conjunction with each other, in union with each other, which means one mind. In other words, our goal, our purpose is identical. And the purpose, as Paul has been making clear from the beginning, is not so that Paul can be praised, not so that he can get out of prison, not even so that the church would be encouraged as the primary goal. The primary goal, the essential goal, in other words, what everything boils down to, is that God himself would be glorified through the church, through Paul, through suffering, through their unity, through the demonstration of the gospel and faith. All of those things, that God would be supremely and absolutely glorified. That's what he is really after, and there's nothing else that comes even close. He uses the word striving here, and there's two words in the Greek New Testament that are often used. One is what we derive the word agony from, or agonize from, and that has to do with contending. So that would be me striving against someone or striving with another person as a kind of combative scenario. But the word that he uses here is a different word for striving. It isn't that word, but instead it's one that means to work in union with somebody to a common goal or to a common purpose. And that's the emphasis that he's placing here, that we're striving together. So rather than striving with someone, we are striving with someone. And that can be taken two ways. He's striving with me could mean he's fighting with me, but I can also say he's striving with me, the emphasis on the with part, in other words, working together. And that's what Paul emphasizes here. And when he says it, of course, he says that we do that with one mind. And we do it, it's an interesting phrase. He doesn't say we do it for the gospel. He says we do it for the faith of the gospel. Now, why would he say that? Why not striving for the gospel or striving for the elevation of the gospel? But he said striving for the faith of the gospel. And that is really, really important, because for the faith, what is the faith? The faith is the one thing that unites all Christians. If you were born and raised in South Sudan, or if you were born and raised in South Manhattan, you're going to have radically different backgrounds and interests and ideas and problems and issues and concerns and motivations, and all of those things are going to be wildly different. But what do we have in common if you're both believers? Our faith. Our faith is what unites us in Jesus Christ and what gives us the ability to strive forward. This is why missions works. This is why I could leave this place and go to another part of the world, even though I don't speak the language and am unfamiliar with the culture. I have a common bond in faith with believers anywhere in the world. I remember a few years ago when I went with my youngest son, Nathan, back to Nepal. It was our third trip to Nepal. And we were in the middle of nowhere, which was just outside of nowhere. I mean, it was a long way from any place where there was what you would consider the conveniences of modern life. And we met with a young church in essentially a thatched roof facility. And we spent the evening talking about the gospel. They asked me to teach from a short section in the scriptures, and we taught about theology and doctrine. And I shared practically nothing in common with these people in terms of background or history or that sort of thing, but we had a common faith. And so the relationship there was so immediate and so tangible that it was quite remarkable. I meet brothers and sisters rather than strangers who might eventually become friends, but brothers and sisters immediately, striving to know more about the gospel of Jesus Christ and to be stronger in their faith, and me with a desire to help them and to teach them and to train them and also to learn from them as they are growing in their faith in ways that I have not. And so a beautiful example of striving in one mind toward a common goal, and it's the faith of Jesus Christ that allows for that. Then he goes on in verse 28, and he says, "In no way alarmed by your opponents, which is a sign of destruction for them, but of salvation for you." Why are we not alarmed by our opponents? Because the gospel invigorates the believer, the Spirit educates, teaches, and guides the believer, and God the Father has given us his Son and the scriptures, the literal word and the written word, in order to inform us about what we believe about our faith. And if that's the case, then we are well equipped to talk with or talk before or talk to anyone about the gospel of Jesus Christ. There's a beautiful passage in early chapters of the book of Acts, Acts chapter 4, where Peter and John are speaking to religious leaders about the gospel. And they're dumbfounded. They can't believe what these men are saying. In fact, let me read the verse to you. This is from Acts chapter 4, verse 13. "Now as they observed the confidence of Peter and John and understood that they were uneducated and untrained men, they were marveling and began to recognize them as having been with Jesus." They said they were uneducated and untrained. The word uneducated is literally agrammatos. They are without grammar, essentially, or they have not been trained or taught in a school setting the way the Pharisees, Sadducees have been taught. And then when they says uneducated and untrained, the word untrained is actually an interesting word that's changed in meaning, idiotes. It didn't mean idiots, the way we might jump to that conclusion. It just meant people who are unprofessional or not in the public eye, but private citizens, as opposed to those who are more public, as the Pharisees would be. So these are men that aren't standing out in front of other people and are not trained educationally, and yet here they are expounding on the Hebrew scriptures in such a way that the Pharisees are dumbfounded. They're puzzled. They're confused because they are illuminating text that to them has never been illuminated before. And then they recognize, oh, wait a minute. I remember these are the guys that were with Jesus. It says at the end, and they began to recognize them as having been with Jesus. They began to see the connection. And that's the point. Think if that verse ended with them being astonished at these uneducated, untrained men, Peter and John, right? Nobodies, fishermen, they're nobodies, teaching them about the truth of the gospel. Well, okay, that's interesting. And where did they get their education and how did that happen? But it doesn't stop with Peter and John. It's the fact that it points them to Jesus Christ, which is what Peter and John were all about. And we see a series of events after that in the book of Acts where they are brought before other religious people, whether it's Peter or John or Stephen or Paul, and they're forced to give account of themselves in a sense, and they do so willingly, and sometimes they're flogged for it, persecuted for it, sometimes simply released and warned. But the point is, in each instance, Jesus Christ is what causes the stir. They lift Christ up, he's magnified, and if they suffer for it, they count themselves as blessed to be able to suffer in the same way that Christ suffered. In fact, that's what he says next at the end of Philippians chapter 1. Verse 28, in no way alarmed by your opponents, which is a sign of destruction for them, but of salvation for you. It indicates that God is working in you. And then in verse 29, for to you it has been granted for Christ's sake, what? Not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for his sake. What has Christ granted us? Belief. We can't even believe on our own. Even faith in what God has done for us comes from God himself. Without faith, we can't please God. Well, we know we can't do anything to please God, so where does that faith come from? It has to come from God himself. God invigorates the heart. God revives the dead soul and breathes into it the breath of life, in a physical sense at the creation of Adam, in a spiritual sense in the creation of the new Adam. As we are born again, we come to take our first breaths. It's because God has brought us forward from the dead. And here we see that we are blessed to be believers, but also we are receiving the blessing of God if we suffer. We tend to think of suffering as something obviously that we would want to avoid, or that is contradictory to a good God, but that's certainly not the case. In fact, this one verse, and I'll read it again in just a second, but this one verse, I think, is one of the strongest that stands in opposition to the health and wealth gospel, that horrible lie that is being preached and distorting the scriptures, and to the destruction of many people who are following it and believing that if they have enough faith, if they can generate enough faith, then they'll get what they want, like God is some kind of big vending machine in the sky, or that God is obligated to do anything for me if I coerce him into doing it because of my ability to believe in a certain way. Listen again to what he says. For to you it has been granted for Christ's sake not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for his sake. God has given us as a blessing the ability to suffer for the sake of Christ. And why? Well, he says, for the sake of Christ, so that Christ would be magnified and glorified. If for a time I have to go through persecution or difficulty or challenge or pain, and Christ is elevated and magnified, well, then that's no different than what Christ went through so that his Father would be magnified. And I not only would willingly embrace that, but I consider it as a blessing. This is why it's puzzling to people who are non-believers how Christians look at persecution. It isn't something that we would run away from and avoid. Of course, if the possibility of not being punished or hurt comes up, you would take that. But if we are being challenged for our faith, if we are being ridiculed, maligned, slandered, punished, hurt, injured because of what we believe, we see that as God working in us and magnifying his own name, and accept it as a blessing from God himself. And then he says at the conclusion, it's experiencing the same conflict which you saw in me and now here to be in me. This is where Paul says we have a commonality. We're going to suffer for the sake of the gospel. And Paul said, I'm doing it from prison. And if I can be released, that's great. If not, that's fine. If I'm able to teach you more, that's great. If I end up dying and going to be with the Father, that's great. But suffering is a part of the Christian experience. And it shouldn't be something that we are upset by. Instead, it should concentrate our minds that what we're striving for together, what we're working for together, is not our own comfort. It's not our best life now and all that garbage that people are spewing. But instead, it's the idea that Christ himself would be magnified in whatever condition I find myself, in whatever condition the church finds itself, persecuted or blessed, allowed to continue doing what we're doing freely in an open place, or restricted from what we're doing because of antagonistic attacks from outside. In either circumstance, so long as Christ is magnified, and that will be exemplified by us because we're striving with one mind, and that is that Christ himself would be magnified and elevated, and above all things, God would be exalted.